On a night with no recorded date, in a hall lit by nothing but oil lamps and the low breath of a hearth fire, a voice began to speak of ships and men and a war fought at the edge of memory. There was no page beneath that voice. There was no ink, no parchment, no hand steadying a stylus against stone. There was only breath and rhythm and the old patient art of holding a room together with sound alone. Pi. We do not know his name for certain, though the world would later call him Homer, and we do not know if he was one man or many, or if he ever existed at all in the way we imagine poets to exist, solitary, aged, sightless, sitting somewhere near a hearth in Ionia, with the sea audible beyond the walls. What we know is quieter than that. We know that somewhere in the long dusk, between the Bronze Age and the Age of Writing, a story was being carried, hall to hall, voice to voice, the way embers are carried between fires, so that nothing is ever fully extinguished. This is the story we now call the Odyssey. And before it was a poem, before it had a shape that could be written down and bound and placed on a shelf, it was something looser and older, a memory of a war and of a man who could not find his way home from it. Long before Homer, if Homer is even the right word for whoever first gathered these fragments into song, there were other voices. There were bards moving from court to court along the coasts of the Aegean, carrying fragments of story the way sailors carry news of storms, half-heard, reshaped, passed on with small variations, until the tale belonged to no one and everyone at once. This is the nature of oral memory. It does not preserve facts so much as it preserves feeling, the emotional shape of an event long after its precise edges have worn away. To understand where this story might have begun, we have to go back further, still past the poem, past the poets, into the world that supposedly gave birth to the tale in the first place, the late Bronze Age, a period so distant that even Homer, whenever he lived, was already looking back at it as a kind of golden ruin. A world grander and stranger than his own. This was the age of Mycenae and Pylos, of palaces built from massive stone, of kings who called themselves one-actes and ruled fortified citadels with their megarons and their frescoed walls, their storerooms stacked with olive oil and wine, their scribes pressing symbols into wet clay with careful, patient hands. It was a world connected by sea in a way that can be difficult to imagine now, when borders feel so solid and the ocean feels like a boundary rather than a road. In the late Bronze Age, the sea was the road. Ships moved between Crete and Egypt, between Cyprus and the Levant, between the Greek mainland and the coast of Anatolia, carrying copper and tin, ivory and glass, pottery and cloth, and the news of kings. It was a world of trade routes so intricate that a single shipwreck, discovered thousands of years later off the coast of Turkey near a headland called Uluburun, would reveal cargo drawn from at least 7 different civilizations. Ingots of copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Afghanistan, ostrich eggshells from Africa, amber beads from the Baltic, golden scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian queen. This was not an age of isolated villages. This was an interconnected world, fragile and magnificent, built on the constant movement of ships across a sea that could be generous in the summer and merciless within a season's turning. And it was a world capable of war on a scale large enough to be remembered, however imperfectly, for 1,000 years afterward. Along the coast of Anatolia, at a place the Hittite records call Wilusa, and which archaeologists would later identify with the mound at Hisarlik, there stood a city that controlled a narrow strait linking 2 seas, a position of extraordinary value in an economy built on maritime trade. Any city that could tax or control passage through such a strait would accumulate wealth simply by existing there. It would also accumulate enemies. We do not know, and likely never will know with certainty, whether a single war was fought there, resembling the one Homer describes, or whether generations of raids and skirmishes over that valuable strip of coastline slowly compressed themselves in memory into one legendary conflict, one 10-year siege. The evidence is fragmentary: burned layers in the ruins of Troy, a Hittite letter referencing conflict near Wilusa, a persistent tradition among the Greeks themselves that something enormous had happened there, something worth singing about for centuries. This is the quiet mystery at the center of everything we are about to explore. Was there a war? Almost certainly something happened. Cities of that era did burn, sieges did occur. Coalitions of raiding kings did sometimes gather against a single wealthy target. But whether it was one war or many, one king or a dozen kings blurred into one, we cannot say with certainty. And it is into this uncertain, smoke-hazed history that a man named Odysseus is said to have sailed home. Was he a real king of a real island? A minor, Bronze Age ruler whose name was preserved because his return, or his failure to return, became a story worth telling? Was he a composite, a figure built from the memories of many sailors who never came home, their individual tragedies folded together into a single mythic wanderer? Or was he in the end simply a myth from the very beginning, a symbol invented to give shape to something the ancient world already understood instinctively, that the sea does not release those who cross it without demanding something in return? This is the question this account will move through slowly, without urgency, without insisting on an answer. We are not here to prove that Odysseus lived. We are not here to disprove it either. We are here, instead, to sit quietly with the evidence as it exists. The archaeology, the Bronze Age trade routes, the Hittite tablets, the burned layers of ancient cities, the geography of the Ionian Sea, and to lay it gently alongside the poem itself, to see where memory and myth may have touched, however briefly, however imperfectly. Centuries ago, there is a particular pleasure in this kind of not knowing. It is different from the pleasure of a solved mystery which closes a door. This is a door left open, deliberately, by time itself. Historians have spent lifetimes examining pottery shards and collapsed megarons, tracing the shift from linear B script to the Greek alphabet, following the slow disintegration of Mycenaean palace culture into what is sometimes called a Dark Age, a period of 2 or 3 centuries where writing itself seems to vanish from the Greek world, leaving behind only oral memory to carry forward whatever had been lost. And it was out of that darkness, that long silence between the fall of the palaces and the rise of the Greek city-states, that a poem eventually emerged, whole and enormous, carrying within it fragments of a much older world. Bronze weapons in a story otherwise dressed in later, unfamiliar customs, place names that matched real Bronze Age settlements. Memories of a kind of kingship that had vanished long before the poem was finally written down. If you find comfort in mysteries that do not need to be solved to be meaningful, if you find a certain peace in sailing alongside old stories without demanding they resolve into hard fact, then you may find this a good place to rest for a while. This channel exists for exactly these kinds of voyages. Quiet explorations of ships and wars and wanderings, half remembered by history, gathered slowly, told gently, meant to accompany you into sleep rather than pull you from it. If that sounds like the kind of company you would like to keep, consider staying a while longer and perhaps returning for the next lost voyage when this one has ended. For now, let us simply begin where the story itself begins. Not in Ithaca, not yet, but in the smoke and wreckage of a fallen city, and the chaos that follows the ending of a 10-year war, when a fleet of ships that should have simply sailed home instead scattered across the sea like sparks thrown from a dying fire. We will move from there, through the fall of Troy and the fractured departure of the Greek kings, through the strange, dreamlike encounters that follow the Lotus Eaters, who offered, forgetting instead of homecoming, the blinded eye of a cyclops in his stone cave, the winds bound in a leather sack, the witch who could turn men, the haunting song of the sirens, the narrow strait between two ancient dangers, the cattle of the sun god grazing on a forbidden island, and finally, after years of delay and loss, the quiet, aching return to a rocky island kingdom that may or may not have existed exactly as the poem describes it. Some of these episodes may reflect real sailing hazards known to Bronze Age mariners, the treacherous currents of certain straits, the disorientation of unfamiliar coastlines, the psychological toll of years spent away from home. Others may be pure invention, poetic elaboration meant to entertain a hall full of listeners on a long winter night. We will hold both possibilities gently without needing to separate them entirely, because that is often how memory and myth travel together across centuries, bound like two ropes twisted into a single line, impossible to fully unweave, and perhaps not meant to be unwoven at all. So, let the fire in that ancient hall burn a little longer. Let the voice, whoever it belonged to, continue. We will follow it now, slowly, out across the wine-dark sea. Long before the poem existed, before any singer had shaped a single line about a wandering king, there was a world of stone and gold and sea salt, a world whose ruins would one day be dug from the earth by men who could not quite believe what their shovels were uncovering. This was the world the poem remembered, however imperfectly, however transformed, by the centuries of voices that carried it forward. To understand the man who sailed away from Troy, we must first understand the world he sailed away from, a world that vanished so completely that later Greeks themselves believed it belonged to gods and demigods rather than to their own ancestors. The late Bronze Age Aegean, the centuries we now call Mycenaean, was a landscape of walled citadels perched on hills, their stones so massive that later generations gazing up at them decided that no mortal hands could have lifted them. They called such walls Cyclopean, imagining giants at work, because it seemed impossible that ordinary men, however many of them, however determined, could have hauled and stacked boulders of that size into place. But mortal hands had done it, over years, over generations, through the patient organization of palatial societies that commanded labor on a scale that would not be seen again in Greece for centuries after their fall. Mycenae itself, the citadel that would give its name to this entire age, sat above a plain in the Peloponnese, its lion gate carved, with two great beasts flanking a pillar, a threshold that visitors and traders and emissaries would have passed beneath for hundreds of years. Unaware that the phrase, rich in gold, the epithet later given to this very city in the poems, was no poetic exaggeration, but a plain description of what lay beneath its floors. When the graves of Mycenae were opened in the 19th century, the man who dug there believed he had found the death mask of Agamemnon himself, the very king who was said to have led the 1,000 ships to Troy. He was wrong about the name. The mask belonged to an earlier age than the war it was thought to commemorate. But he was not wrong about the wealth, nor about the reality that lay behind the poetic memory. Here, gold masks pressed over the faces of the dead, gold cups, gold-hilted swords, gold ornaments sewn into burial shrouds. This was a society whose rulers were buried with a splendor that matched, and perhaps inspired, the golden imagery that clings to every page of the old epics. The audience who first listened to songs of golden-masked kings were not hearing pure invention. They were hearing, filtered through centuries of retelling, the actual glimmer of a civilization that had once been real, had once ruled these same hills, had once vanished into ruin and legend. Mycenae was not alone. Across the Peloponnese and into central Greece, other palatial centers rose in this same age. Pylos on the western coast, Tiryns near the sea, Thebes to the north, each a fortified seat of a wanax. a lord who ruled not merely a town, but a network of villages, farms, workshops, and ports that answered to his authority. These were not simple chieftains presiding over scattered huts. They were the heads of complex bureaucratic states, states that kept records, taxed production, organized labor, and maintained standing military forces equipped with bronze armor and chariots. It was a world of walls and watchtowers, of harbors busy with ships, of workshops turning out pottery and textiles and metalwork that traveled far beyond the shores of Greece to Egypt, to the Levant, to Cyprus, to the Hittite lands of Anatolia. The Mycenaeans were traders as much as warriors, sailors as much as soldiers, and it is worth pausing on this point, because it matters for the story that follows. The man who would become Odysseus, whatever kernel of a real captain or composite of captains lay behind him, belonged to a culture that already knew the sea intimately, that had already sent ships beyond the horizon for generations before any siege of Troy was fought or sung about. The ships of this age were not the great oared galleys of later centuries, not yet the triremes that would dominate later Greek naval imagination. And they were long, narrow vessels built for speed rather than cargo capacity, propelled by oarsmen and steadied by a single sail when the wind allowed, their hulls low in the water, their prows sometimes curved upward in a shape that later artists would render again and again on pottery and seal stones. Such ships could carry raiding parties or trading goods with equal ease, and often did both across the course of a single voyage. The line between merchant and raider in this world was thinner than we might imagine. A captain who traded peacefully in one port might, in leaner years or with a weaker target in sight, take by force what he could not buy. This dual nature, trader and raider both, sits at the very heart of the Wandering King's later reputation. His cleverness admired as much as his violence, his willingness to lie and scheme, treated not as moral failing, but as a necessary and even admirable skill, in a world where the line between commerce and conquest was rarely fixed. The Mycenaean world traded obsidian and bronze, oil and wine, finely painted pottery that has been found scattered from the Nile Delta to the coasts of Italy, evidence of a trading network far more extensive than earlier historians once believed. Amber came down from the north, along routes that stretched across the whole of Europe, passed from hand to hand until it reached the workshops of Mycenae to be set into gold. Tin arrived from distant sources to be alloyed with copper into the bronze that armed their warriors, since neither metal alone existed in useful quantity within Greece itself, meaning that every sword, every spear point, every ornamental blade depended on lines of trade that stretched for hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles beyond the borders of any single kingdom. In this way, war and commerce were never separate concerns for these people. The metal that made you strong in battle came from the same channels of exchange that made you wealthy in peace, and control of the sea routes was not a luxury, but a necessity woven into the very possibility of survival. Warrior culture ran deep in this civilization, visible in the frescoes that once covered palace walls, showing processions of soldiers with figure-8 shields and boar's tusk helmets, showing hunting scenes and combat scenes, rendered with a vividness that speaks to a society that prized martial skill highly, that expected its elite to be warriors first and administrators second, though in practice the two roles blurred constantly. Chariots appear in the archaeological record and in later poetic memory alike, though by the time of any historical war at Troy, if such a war occurred, chariots may have already been used more as transport to the battlefield than as true instruments of massed cavalry charge, a detail the later epic seems to remember imperfectly, describing chariot warfare in ways that sometimes contradict the practical realities uncovered by archaeologists. This is one of the clearest signs that the poem, however much real memory it carries, was not composed by eyewitnesses to the events it describes, but by later generations reconstructing a world already passing from lived memory into legend. Yet the palaces themselves left something behind that speaks with a clarity no myth can match. Clay tablets, baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them, preserved by catastrophe rather than despite it. These tablets, written in a script we now call Linear B, sat unread and unreadable for more than 3,000 years until a young architect working obsessively in his spare hours finally deciphered them in the middle of the 20th century and revealed, to the astonishment of scholars everywhere, that the language recorded on these ancient clay fragments was an early form of Greek. The tablets themselves are not epic poetry, not songs of heroism, not tales of gods and monsters. They are lists, inventories of grain, tallies of livestock, records of textile production, rosters of temple offerings, accounts of land holdings, and the workers who tended them. They are the paperwork of a bureaucratic state, dry and administrative, and yet within that dryness lies an enormous gift, because these tablets confirm, in exact and unglamorous detail, that the world described in later poetry was built upon something real. Names appear in these records that echo names later used for gods and heroes, a detail that has fascinated scholars for decades, suggesting that some figures later worshipped as divine or celebrated as legendary may have had roots reaching back into this actual bureaucratic world of scribes. The tablets also reveal the presence of a large labor force, including women recorded as textile workers, war captives noted by the towns they came from, evidence of a slave-holding, hierarchical society in which the movement of people, whether by trade or capture. This detail matters because it means the world Homer's audience imagined. The world of captured women given as prizes, of slaves taken in war and folded into households, was not poetic invention layered onto a peaceful past. It was, in its grim outlines, an accurate reflection of how this society actually functioned, long before any war at Troy could have added its own portion of captives to the record. Then, sometime in the 12th century before the Common Era, this entire world came apart. The palaces burned. Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, one after another, in a wave of destruction whose causes remain debated to this day. Some scholars point to invasion, others to internal collapse, to earthquake, to famine, to the broader crisis that swept across the eastern Mediterranean in this same terrible century, toppling kingdoms far beyond Greece's shores. Whatever the cause, the palatial system did not recover. Writing itself vanished from Greece for nearly 400 years. The scribal class that had maintained the Linear B records, disappearing along with the palaces they served, leaving no continuous written record of what followed. This gap, this long silence, is often called a dark age, though it was not truly dark to the people who lived through it, only dark to us who cannot read what they left behind because they left behind so little that could be read at all. And yet something survived that silence carried not on clay or parchment but on human breath, passed from one generation of singers to the next through 4 centuries in which writing had vanished but memory had not. Fragments of the old world persisted in this oral inheritance. The shape of a shield, the name of a wealthy city, the golden gleam of a long-vanished court, the outline of ships that had once sailed to Egypt and back. By the time writing returned to Greece, in a new alphabet borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, the memory of that lost Bronze Age world had traveled through hundreds of years of retelling, reshaped by each generation of singers who added their own understanding, their own embellishments, their own contemporary details borrowed from the world they actually inhabited. It is this long inheritance, this centuries-deep sediment of memory and invention pressed together, that the poem finally captured when it was at last written down. A world before Troy, glimpsed through a golden haze, real enough to leave its gold in the ground for us to find, and distant enough that even its own descendants had begun to mistake it for legend. There is a low hill in northwestern Turkey, not far from the mouth of the Dardanelles, where the wind moves through dry grass and the sea can still be glimpsed in the distance, silver and patient, much as it might have been glimpsed 3,000 years before. The hill is called Hesarlik. It rises only modestly above the surrounding plain, unremarkable to any traveler who might pass without knowing what lies beneath it. But beneath that quiet rise lie the compressed remains of at least 9 cities, one built upon the ruins of another, layer settling on layer across 4,000 years of habitation, destruction, and return. It was here in the 1870s that a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann arrived with a copy of Homer in one hand and an unshakable conviction in the other. The conviction that the poem was not merely poetry, but memory. That somewhere beneath the soil of Anatolia, the actual stones of Troy still waited to be found. Schliemann was not a careful man by the standards later archaeologists would come to demand. He was a merchant who had made a fortune in trade before turning to antiquity with the fervor of a convert, and his early excavations at Hissarlik were driven more by hunger for confirmation than by patience for method. He dug quickly, sometimes recklessly, cutting a great trench through the mound in his eagerness to reach what he believed must lie at the bottom, the Troy of Priam, the Troy of Homer, the city whose walls had supposedly held against 10 years of siege. In his haste, he tore through layers that later scholars would give a great deal to have preserved intact, destroying evidence even as he searched for it, mistaking one error for another, misreading the very ground he was so desperate to understand. And yet, whatever his flaws, his conviction was not entirely misplaced. Something was there. The hill was not empty. Beneath the tangled roots and wind-blown dust, the remains of an ancient citadel did lie waiting, layer after layer of walls and hearths and shattered pottery. A settlement that had risen, fallen, and risen again across centuries so vast that no single story could account for all of it. What Schliemann and those who followed him found, once the picture came into clearer focus, was not one Troy but many, a sequence of cities built atop one another, each identified by archaeologists with a Roman numeral, from Troy I in the depths of the early Bronze Age to Troy I Ents in the later Classical and Roman periods. Each layer told its own story of habitation, prosperity, and destruction. Some cities had ended in earthquake, their walls collapsed by a violence that came from the ground itself rather than from human hands. Others had ended in fire that may have come from accident or from conflict, or from causes now lost entirely to time. It was somewhere in the middle layers, in the level that archaeologists came to call Troy's Sixth E, that Schliemann believed he had found his prize, a city grander than the others, with impressive fortifications and evidence of wealth. But later, excavation would complicate even this certainty. Troy V appeared to have ended, not in the fire of war, but in the shaking of an earthquake, its walls thrown down by the trembling earth rather than by soldiers scaling them in the dark. It was the layer just above this one, the one archaeologists labeled Troy Vita, that would eventually draw the closest attention from those searching for a war that may have actually happened. This city was smaller than its predecessor, more crowded, its houses pressed closer together as though built in haste or under pressure, its storage jars sunk into floors as if its people had expected difficulty, had expected to need reserves close at hand. And Troy Vivi did end in fire. The evidence is there in the blackened stones, in the layers of ash that still separate this city from the one that rose after it, in the scattered signs of sudden catastrophe, collapsed roofs, skeletal remains left unburied in the rubble. arrowheads of a type associated with the Eastern Aegean world, found among the wreckage of houses that had clearly burned. Whether this destruction came from war or from some other calamity that merely resembled war in its aftermath remains a question that no single arrowhead can answer with certainty, but the pattern is suggestive. A city under evident strain, a sudden and violent end, a conflagration significant enough to leave its mark for archaeologists to uncover more than 3,000 years later. It would be too simple and too generous to the evidence to say that this proves the war of the poem happened precisely as it was sung. 10 years of siege, a horse built of wood, the death of princes, and the fall of walls beneath the will of gods. Archaeology speaks in fragments and probabilities, not confirmations. What the layers of Hisarlik can offer is not a story, but a shadow of one. The outline of a city that suffered a great and sudden destruction at approximately the right period in history, in approximately the right location, at a scale that would have been remembered, retold, and slowly transformed by those who survived it or heard of its fall from others. This is not nothing, but neither is it proof. It is the kind of evidence that invites reflection rather than certainty, that asks the listener to hold two truths at once, that something significant happened here and that we may never know precisely what. There is another thread of evidence, one that comes not from the soil of Hisarlik itself, but from clay tablets found hundreds of miles away in the archives of a civilization that once ruled much of Anatolia, the Hittites, whose empire rose and fell in roughly the same centuries that saw the destruction of Troy Severna. Among the thousands of cuneiform records recovered from Hittite archives, scholars have found repeated mention of a place called Wilusa, a city or region on the western edge of Hittite influence, near the coast, involved at various points in treaties, disputes, and diplomatic tension. The name itself bears a striking resemblance to an older form of the Greek name for Troy, Ilios, or, in its earlier form, Wilios. Close enough in sound and geography that many scholars now consider it likely, though not certain, that Wilusa and Troy were one and the same place, known to different peoples by names that had drifted apart over centuries of separate use. The Hittite records do not describe a war fought over a queen, nor do they mention any hero by a name that could be matched with confidence to Odysseus or Achilles. What they offer instead is something quieter and in its way more convincing, a portrait of Wilusa as a real place with real political weight, a kingdom or city-state caught between larger powers, occasionally allied with the Hittites, existing within a network of treaties and tensions that stretched across the Aegean and into Anatolia. Some tablets mention conflict involving the western coastal regions. Others mention a ruler of Wilusa by name, a detail that grounds the place further in the texture of verifiable history rather than the mist of legend. Taken together, these fragments suggest that whatever else the poem became through centuries of retelling, it was rooted in a landscape that once held real cities, real kings, real disputes over land and trade and loyalty, the ordinary material from which wars, when they came, were made. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet space between the archaeological evidence and the poem's grand telling, to consider how the memory of catastrophe becomes myth. A city burns. Its people scatter, or are killed, or are taken as captives to serve in households far from home. Those who survive carry the memory of what happened with them, the smoke, the sound of falling walls, the names of those who did not escape. In the first years after such an event, the memory is raw and specific, carried by people who witnessed it directly, who could describe the exact hour the fire began, the direction from which the attackers came, the fate of particular families. But memory does not remain static. It passes from those who witnessed the event to those who only heard of it, and in that passing detail begins to soften, to generalize, to bend toward the shapes that stories naturally prefer. Heroes rather than soldiers, kings rather than administrators. A single grand cause rather than the tangled mess of politics and trade disputes and accident that likely lay behind any real conflict. Across generations, sung by different voices in different courts and villages, added to and reshaped by singers who could not resist making the tale grander, more resonant, more worthy of their audience's evening by the fire. The story of a burned city on the Anatolian coast slowly became the story of the Trojan War, a war fought not over trade routes or political alliance, but over the abduction of a woman whose beauty was said to be unmatched, a war in which gods themselves took sides. This is not deception, not in any deliberate sense. It is simply what memory does when it survives without the anchor of writing, drifting gradually from event toward meaning, from record toward resonance, until the story that remains tells us less about the precise facts of what happened and more about what those facts came to mean to the people who kept retelling them. And so the war that may have been sits at the heart of the epic like a smoldering ember beneath ash, real enough to have left its mark in burned timber and broken pottery, real enough to be glimpsed, however faintly, in the diplomatic tablets of a neighboring empire, and yet transformed so thoroughly by the centuries of retelling that separate the burning of Troy Sevna from the composition of the poem that no clean line can be drawn between the history and the myth. The two are braided together now, inseparable, each lending the other a kind of weight, the history granting the myth its ancient roots in real fire and real loss, the myth granting the history a permanence it could never have earned on the strength of broken pottery alone. What remains, when the poem is set beside the excavated hill, is not a solved mystery, but a deepened one. The quiet, abiding sense that somewhere beneath the layers of Hisarlik, something did happen, something significant enough to be remembered, became a story large enough to outlive the very stones it first grew from. It is into this uncertain space between the burned city and the song that outlasted it that a single figure now steps forward, a man the poem calls Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of a small and rocky island, a man whose name would travel farther than any ship he ever sailed. To ask whether Odysseus existed is to ask a question the ancient world itself never quite settled. He is, first and clearly, a literary invention, a character shaped by generations of oral poets long before Homer's version was fixed into the words that survive. His cunning, his restlessness, his particular blend of courage and deceit, his gift for speech that could calm a mob or talk his way past a monster. These are the tools of storytelling, sharpened across countless retellings, around countless fires. And yet, beneath the invention, many who have studied the Bronze Age world in which the poem is set have wondered whether Odysseus, like the war he returns from, might be a composite, a gathering of memory rather than a single remembered man. Small kingdoms did exist along the western edge of the Greek world in the centuries before the poem took its final shape. Local rulers, warrior chiefs commanding modest fleets and modest halls, did sail to join larger campaigns when the great powers of the mainland called for men and ships. It is not difficult to imagine that somewhere in that world there was a king of a small island who was known for his cleverness, who survived a long and difficult return from some distant war, whose story was told and retold until it gathered other stories to itself, the tales of sailors blown off course, of ships lost in strange waters, of homecomings delayed by storm and grief and the slow erosion of hope. In this way, Odysseus becomes something larger than a single life. He becomes a vessel, in the poem's own sense of the word, carrying within him the memory of many voyages that likely never touched a single shore in the manner the poem describes. yet may each have been real enough to someone once, long before they became woven into the fabric of one man's name. The island he is said to rule, Ithaca, offers its own quiet mystery, one that has occupied scholars and sailors alike for well over 2,000 years. The poem describes it with unusual care for a work otherwise more interested in gods and monsters than in cartography. It speaks of a rugged, mountainous land, unsuited to horses, better suited to goats, a place of steep paths and hidden harbours, visible from neighbouring islands yet somehow set apart, low-lying to the west and higher toward the east, encircled by other islands whose names the poem also gives. For centuries, travellers and geographers assumed this description matched the island that has carried the name Ithaca since antiquity, a slender strip of land in the Ionian Sea, its hills folding down toward narrow bays, its interior threaded with old goat paths that still wind between white stone walls and silver-leafed olive groves. Visitors have walked those paths for generations, tracing what they believe to be the very geography Homer described, standing at harbours that local tradition long identified with the poem's port of Phorcys, where the poem says the sleeping Odysseus was finally set down by the Phaeacian sailors who carried him home. And yet the match between poem and stone has never been perfect, and it is in this imperfection that much of the modern fascination lives. Some details align with striking clarity: the island's rocky, goat-favouring terrain, its position relative to neighbouring islands, the general sense of a modest, hardy kingdom rather than a grand palace state. Other details resist alignment entirely. The poem's description of Ithaca's position relative to the mainland and its neighbouring islands has led some scholars, examining the geography line by line, to argue that the ancient poet may have been describing a different landmass altogether, perhaps the peninsula now called Palicki on the neighbouring island of Kephallonia, place once possibly separated from the rest of that island by a narrow channel that has since filled with earth and stone over the intervening centuries, reshaped by the slow work of tectonic movement in a region known for its restless ground. Geological studies conducted in recent decades have lent some support to this possibility, finding evidence that the western part of Kephallonia may indeed have once been separated from the rest by open water, a strait that would have made the peninsula an island in its own right, closer perhaps to the shape the poem so carefully describes. Whether this proposed shifting of geography solves the question or merely deepens, it remains genuinely unresolved, and it is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than rushing past it, for it says something important about how differently poetry and stone keep their records. The land moves slowly, according to its own patient violence, while the poem, once fixed into memorized lines and later into written text, does not move at all. It preserves a moment, or an impression of a moment frozen in language long after the ground beneath it has shifted into something else. Archaeology on Ithaca itself, the traditionally named island, has produced its own quiet clues, unglamorous but persistent. Excavations at a site known as the School of Homer on a hill above the island's northern coast have uncovered the remains of what appears to have been a substantial building from the Mycenaean period, along with terracing, pottery fragments, and evidence of continuous habitation stretching across many centuries. Nearby, a cave long associated by local tradition with the poem's Cave of the Nymphs, the place where the poem says Odysseus hid the treasures given to him by his Phaeacian hosts, has yielded ancient offerings, small clay figurines, pottery shards, suggesting the cave held religious significance for the island's inhabitants long before and long after any possible Trojan War. These are not proof of Odysseus. They are proof only that people lived on this island in the right general era, that they built modest structures suited to a modest kingdom, that they honored certain caves and certain hills with lasting devotion. Whether any of them ever called their king by the name later given to him in song is a question the pottery cannot answer, and perhaps was never meant to. There is, in this gap between poetic geography and physical landscape, a tension worth sitting with quietly, without any pressure to resolve it. The sea described in the poem does not always match the sea that a sailor crossing these waters today would recognize. Distances shift. Islands change their relative positions in ways that suggest either poetic license or a poet working from second-hand knowledge, oral tradition compressed and reshaped across generations of retelling until precise navigation gave way to the looser logic of memory and song. This is not a flaw particular to the Odyssey. It is, in fact, characteristic of oral epic more broadly, where geography often serves emotional and symbolic purposes as much as literal ones. A distance can be exaggerated to increase the sense of exile. An island can be moved slightly closer or farther to serve the rhythm of a verse or the drama of a homecoming delayed. The poem's world was never intended to function as a map in the modern sense, precise and verifiable. It was meant to be sung, to be felt, to carry an audience across water they may never have sailed themselves, using landmarks that were as much emotional as physical. The shape of longing given a shoreline, the ache of exile given a specific nameable island toward which a man might struggle for 10 long years. And yet, the human need to place legend upon real stone and real coastline has never faded, has perhaps only grown stronger with the passing centuries. Ancient travelers sought out Ithaca as pilgrims might seek a shrine, walking its paths and pointing to caves and harbors with the quiet certainty of those who need their stories to have a physical home. Later scholars, armed with surveying instruments and geological samples, have continued this same essential pursuit, translated into more modern methods, but driven by something unchanged beneath the surface, the wish to know that the man who could not stop longing for home walked, or might have walked, upon ground that can still be touched, that the harbor where the exhausted sailors laid him down while he slept still holds water that catches the same morning light it caught 3,000 years before. There is comfort in this insistence, even when the evidence remains stubbornly incomplete, even when geologists and classicists continue to debate whether the island of legend and the island of maps are the same place at all. Perhaps this comfort is itself the truest inheritance of the poem, not a solved question of latitude and longitude, but a reminder that stories, however invented, however composite, however woven from many remembered men rather than one, still reach for real ground beneath them. A cave where offerings once were left by hands, now 3,000 years turned to dust. The sea does not always match the song, but the wish to make it match, the patient work of walking real coastlines with an old poem held quietly in mind, remains one of the most human gestures a reader can make, an act of faith performed, not in a temple, but on a rocky path above a blue and indifferent sea, searching for a king who may have been many kings, on an island that may have moved, in a story that was never meant to hold still. For 10 years, the walls of Troy had held, according to the poem's telling, and for 10 years, the plain before the city had absorbed the blood and bronze of men on both sides who had grown old in the waiting. The war, if it happened as sung, was not a swift thing. It was a slow erosion, a grinding patience on both sides. Armies that had built something resembling permanent camps, kings who had buried sons and nephews and companions in makeshift graves along a shore that was never meant to be a homeland. Homer does not linger on the war's ending in the Odyssey itself. That story belongs more properly to other songs, other fragments, the Iliad and the lost epics that once filled in the gaps around it. But the Odyssey carries its memory the way a man carries an old wound, present in every limp, every pause before certain words. The war is over by the time we meet Odysseus. What remains is the getting home. And to understand the getting home, the poem insists we understand, if only briefly, how the war ended, and what a man might carry away from an ending like that. The horse is the detail that survives longest in memory. The way certain images survive centuries when whole speeches and strategies are forgotten. A wooden horse, hollow within, built on the counsel of Odysseus himself, according to the tradition that surrounds the poem, filled with a small number of Greek warriors who endured the terror of confined darkness and uncertain fate, while their comrades pretended to sail away, burning their camps behind them, leaving the horse as an offering to the gods. Peace gift, a puzzle for the Trojans to solve. The Trojans in the story brought it inside their own walls. They celebrated. They believed the war was over. And in the night, the men within the horse climbed down and opened the gates, and the fleet that had pretended to leave returned under cover of darkness, and the city that had held for 10 years fell in a single night of fire and slaughter. It is a magnificent story, and like most magnificent stories, it deserved to be examined slowly rather than believed instantly or dismissed instantly. Bronze Age siege warfare, as archaeology and comparative history have come to understand it, did not typically resolve itself through elaborate trick devices. Sieges were usually resolved through starvation, through the slow strangling of supply lines, through betrayal from within, through the simple accumulation of exhaustion until one side's will broke before the others. A wooden horse, large enough to conceal armed men, wheeled or carried through a gate, accepted without deep suspicion by a city that had spent a decade at war, with the very people offering the gift. This stretches credulity when examined as literal military history. And yet stretching credulity is precisely what myth is built to do. It takes the plausible bones of an event and layers onto them the kind of story that will be remembered, retold, sung at firesides for 1,000 years after the actual tactics, whatever they were, have been forgotten entirely. Some historians have proposed that the horse may be a poetic transformation of a siege engine, a battering ram, or a salt tower sheathed in wood and hide, the kind of apparatus that could, indeed, have been described generations later as a great wooden beast brought to a city's gates. Others suggest the horse may be a memory of treachery, a gate opened from within by a bribed guard or a disaffected noble. The horse itself, a later embellishment, a way of turning an ugly betrayal into a story with more wonder and less shame. Still others point to the horse as a symbol entirely tied to Poseidon, god of both the sea and of earthquakes, whom the ancients associated with horses as a sacred animal. An earthquake that breached the walls, they suggest, might have been remembered generations later as a gift of the horse god and slowly transformed, through the accumulating distortions of oral retelling, into the image of an actual horse built of wood. None of these explanations can be proven. All of them are more plausible in the narrow sense of military and geological likelihood than a literal hollow horse, accepted whole by a suspicious and battle-hardened city. And yet none of them carry the same weight in memory as the horse itself, standing in the moonlight outside walls that do not yet know they are already lost. What can be said with more confidence is that cities in this era did fall. Sometimes suddenly, sometimes through methods that combined siege, treachery, environmental catastrophe, and simple exhaustion in ways no single word or image could capture. Troy itself, the archaeological site now called hillside, shows layers of destruction across its long history. Cities built atop cities, some ending in fire, some in earthquake, some simply abandoned and rebuilt by later hands with little continuity of memory. Somewhere within those layers may lie the seed of the story, a city that burned, walls that fell, a population scattered or enslaved or slaughtered, remembered later by descendants of the victors as a triumph worth singing about for as long as there were voices left to sing. The Odyssey does not dwell on the destruction itself with lingering description, but it does not let the listener forget what happened either. The fires are recalled indirectly in reference in the weight Odysseus carries, in the way certain scenes later in the poem show him weeping without explanation when a bard sings of Troy's fall, say, weeping in a way that reveals more than any direct account could. A man who has seen a city die and who carries that seeing inside him the way sailors carry salt in their skin, permanently, invisibly, until something reminds them of the sea they came from. This restraint, this refusal to indulge in spectacle for its own sake, is part of what gives the poem its enduring calm even amid catastrophe. The burning of Troy is not the point of the Odyssey. It is the hinge on which the entire story turns, the moment after which nothing can be the same. But it is treated with the gravity of memory rather than the excitement of action. After the fires died and the ash settled over what had been a great city, the Greek fleet, assembled from 12 kingdoms, 100 ships, thousands of men who had left their homes as young warriors and now stood as older men amid the wreckage of their long labor, prepared to sail home. And here, the poem offers one of its most quietly devastating details. The fleet did not stay together, it scattered. Some ships turned for home swiftly and reached their shores within weeks, their captains wise enough or lucky enough to read the winds correctly, to make the right sacrifices to the right gods, to avoid whatever storms and dangers awaited those who lingered. Other ships were destroyed outright in storms that some ancient sources tie to the anger of the gods over acts of impiety committed during the sack of the city, the desecration of temples, the violation of altars, the killing of those who had sought sanctuary at sacred sites. Whether these stories reflect actual weather events recorded in the oral memory of the era, or whether they are simply the moral framework ancient peoples used to explain misfortune, is impossible to know with certainty. What can be said is that the eastern Mediterranean of this period was no stranger to violent seasonal storms, and a fleet of ships built for coastal sailing rather than open sea endurance, caught far from safe harbor in autumn or winter weather, would have been extraordinarily vulnerable. A single storm system sweeping through the Aegean at the wrong moment could easily have scattered 100 ships across dozens of different coastlines, sinking some, driving others far off their intended course, separating captains from allies they had fought beside for a decade. This scattering becomes the mechanism by which the poem transforms from a war story into a wandering story. Menelaus, we are told, found his way home only after years of drifting through Egypt and other distant shores. Agamemnon returned swiftly, only to meet a darker fate waiting for him in his own halls, a story the poem references without dwelling on, content to let it serve as a contrast to Odysseus's own eventual homecoming. And Odysseus himself, whose ships had at first sailed together in a group, found his own fleet slowly destroyed and reduced across a series of encounters, until he stood, eventually, entirely alone, the last survivor of a war party that had once numbered in the hundreds. 10 years the war had lasted, and 10 years the journey home would take, a symmetry the poem clearly intends as meaningful rather than accidental. 2 decades total, half spent in the grinding patience of siege, half spent in a different kind of endurance entirely. The endurance of a man who cannot find his way home despite wanting nothing else in the world. Some historians have wondered whether this 10-year wandering, so precisely mirrored against the 10-year war, might carry within it the memory of something more mundane than monsters and enchantresses, the long, slow patterns of Bronze Age trade routes, the kind of extended voyaging that merchant sailors of the era might have undertaken across multiple seasons, visiting distant ports, waiting out unfavorable winds in foreign harbors, trading in one place before moving to the next, the entire circuit taking years rather than weeks. A returning soldier turned trader, delayed not by monsters but by business, by winter anchorages, by the simple slowness of ancient sea travel across a vast and only partially charted world, might have taken almost as long to complete his circuit as the poem allows for Odysseus's fantastical journey. The wonders came later, added by generations of storytellers eager to fill the long, undocumented years with something more thrilling than harbor fees and cargo counts. It is into this uncertain space, part memory of real delay, part invention meant to entertain, that the poem now steers its hero. The scattered fleet is gone. The other captains have taken their own paths, toppled by their own fates. Odysseus, with his remaining ships and remaining men, turns his prow toward home, expecting perhaps a voyage of some difficulty, but nothing beyond the ordinary hazards a returning soldier might expect. The wind rises, and before long, his ships are carried past the boundaries of anything resembling a known coastline toward a shore where the very taste of the local plant will make men forget the shape of their own names, forget the weight of a wife's hand, forget entirely and gently the desire to go home at all. The sea, for a time, gives no sign of what it intends. The wind that carried them past the last recognizable headland does not howl or rage. It simply persists, day after day, pushing the ships along a course no pilot among them had charted, no elder among them had sailed before. There is no violence in this drift, only a kind of quiet insistence, as though the water itself has decided where these men are meant to go, and the men, exhausted from grief and rowing, have little strength left to argue with it. The sails hang slack in the long windless hours between gusts. The oars dip and lift with the dull rhythm of men who row, because rowing is what hands do when the mind has nothing left to offer. 9 days, the old telling says. 9 days of drifting under a sun that does not seem to move with any urgency. 9 days of salt-cracked lips and eyes that scan a horizon, offering nothing but more horizon, until at last a coastline rises from the haze, low, pale, shimmering with a heat the Greeks have not felt before, fringed with a vegetation none of them recognize. They do not know this shore. No one among them has sailed these waters, and the maps carried only in memory, past sailor to sailor across generations, hold no name for this place. It is simply land, and land, after so long adrift, is enough. The ships turn toward it with the relief of men who have forgotten, for the moment, to be wary. And Odysseus, ever the careful captain even in his weariness, sends a small party ashore, not the whole crew, not himself even, but 3 men chosen, perhaps, for steadiness or expendability, to learn what this coast might offer before the rest commit their exhausted bodies to it. It is a small decision, made in the ordinary caution of command, and it becomes in the telling one of the most consequential choices in the entire voyage. The 3 men walk inland along the pale sand, and what they find is not danger in any form they might have anticipated. No monster waits in ambush. No armed defenders rush to meet them. Instead, they find a people who seem, at first encounter, entirely peaceable. A folk untroubled by the arrival of strangers, offering welcome rather than the wariness or violence that has met the fleet at other unfamiliar coasts. This gentleness, this immediate hospitality, will prove far more dangerous than any sword. The Lotus Eaters, the story calls them, and the name has traveled 28 centuries precisely because of what it names. Not a place, not a tribe with a lineage or a king or a war of their own, but a habit, a condition, an entire way of being organized around a single plant, and what that plant does to memory. The lotus itself, in the old telling, bears fruit that tastes sweeter than anything the sailors have known, a honeyed richness that seems on the tongue like a small mercy after so much salt and hunger. And with that first taste comes a stillness the men have not felt in years, not the peace of rest which restores a man to himself, but a deeper dissolving, a softening at the edges of thought where worry and longing and the ache of distance simply cease to trouble. The three sailors eat, offered freely by their hosts, who seem to want nothing from the strangers but to share what sustains them. And having eaten, the men find that the ships waiting on the shore, the captain who sent them, the wives and fathers and sons left behind across the sea, all of it grows distant, then dim, then finally unimportant, in a way that carries no anguish, no sense of loss, only a gentle indifference. They do not wish to return. This is the detail that makes the episode so quietly unsettling in the telling. There is no captivity here, no chain, no wall. The lotus does not imprison men. It simply removes, with great tenderness, their reason to leave. When the three do not return, Odysseus does not wait long before going to find them himself, and what he encounters when he does. His own men, seated among strangers, their faces slack, with a contentment that has nothing left of urgency or homesickness in it, must have struck him as stranger than any monster he had yet faced. Because here was no enemy to fight, only friends who no longer wished to be rescued. The old story says he has them bound and carried back to the ships by force, weeping. The telling notes, though it does not say whether the weeping was for the home they had briefly forgotten or for the sweetness of forgetting itself, now being pulled away from them against their will. Bound to the rowing benches, they are given no choice but to return to the labor of oars, to the ache of memory, to the unfinished business of getting home. And Odysseus, watching his fleet make hastily for open water again, gives the order that no one is to eat of that fruit, not out of cruelty, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that some comforts are more dangerous than any storm, because a storm, at least, leaves a man wanting to survive it. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet, after the ships have pulled away from that pale shore, to ask what such a story might actually be describing beneath its poetry. The scholars and travelers who have turned their attention to this episode over the centuries have generally agreed on one thing. The lotus eaters, whatever else they may be, likely reflect some real contact, however distorted by retelling, between early Greek sailors and the peoples of the North African coast. And in the regions later known to history as Libya, or the shores near what would become Cyrenaica and its surrounding tribal lands. Herodotus himself, writing centuries after Homer, but drawing on his own travels and inquiries, describes a people he calls the Litophagi, living along this very coastline, eating a fruit he identifies with a specific plant, likely the jujube or a related shrub bearing a small, date-like fruit that was, by his account, genuinely eaten by real communities as a staple food and even fermented into a kind of wine. There is nothing supernatural in Herodotus's version. The fruit is simply food, pleasant enough that visitors, in his telling, sometimes found themselves reluctant to leave a place where it grew in such abundance, a detail that, stripped of Homer's enchantment, sounds remarkably close to the ordinary human experience of encountering good hospitality in a foreign land and feeling for a moment. 2. Less eager to go home than one expected. But between the plain account of a traveling historian and the aching myth of a forgetting fruit, there is a wide space where imagination, memory, and the disorientation of early sea travel all blur together. It is worth considering that the Greek sailors who first encountered such a coast after months at sea, undernourished, sun-worn, perhaps already half delirious with fatigue, would have met among the lotus eaters not only unfamiliar people but unfamiliar plants, entirely some of which may have carried properties far beyond mere sweetness. The ancient Mediterranean world was not ignorant of psychoactive substances. Opium poppies were cultivated and understood. Certain wines were deliberately adulterated with additives that dulled or altered awareness. and various regional plants across North Africa and the Near East were known, in folk practice if not formal science, to induce states of drowsy euphoria, disorientation, or diminished will. It is not difficult to imagine some genuine encounter, sailors given an unfamiliar fruit or drink by hosts who meant only kindness, and finding themselves, afterward, strangely unwilling to leave, their minds pleasantly clouded in a way they could not explain and did not particularly wish to resist. Memory itself, of course, is an unreliable vessel, even without the aid of any actual plant. Sailors returning from long voyages have always told stories that grow stranger with each retelling, not necessarily from dishonesty, but from the simple fact that trauma, exhaustion, and cultural unfamiliarity reshape memory even as it forms. A gentle island where strangers were fed and made welcome, where the food was good and the pace of life slower than the punishing rhythm of the sea, might easily transform across generations of retelling, around fires and at feasts. One to an island of dangerous enchantment, because what else could explain 3 trained soldiers utterly forgetting their homes, their captain, their war? The Greeks needed no plant, perhaps, to make sense of an experience that was, in its plainer form, simply the ordinary seduction of comfort after hardship, dressed in the language of magic, because magic was the only vocabulary available for describing how easily a tired man's resolve can dissolve. Whatever the truth beneath it, the episode of the Lotus Eaters carries a stillness that sets it apart from the horrors soon to come. There is no blood in this waypoint, no screaming, no monster's cave. There is only forgetting, offered freely, taken gladly, and refused finally by a captain who understood, whether from wisdom or simple stubbornness, that his men's survival depended on remembering what they most wished, in that fragrant and drowsy place, to forget entirely. The ships pull away from that pale coast with their full crews restored, oars dipping once more into open water, sails catching a wind that carries them onward toward destinations no less strange, but considerably less gentle. Behind them, the land of the Lotus Eaters fades into haze and then into nothing, a soft and honeyed memory that most of the men will carry, perhaps as the one moment of true peace in a voyage about to grow very much darker. Ahead, unseen and unnamed as yet, waits a shore of jagged black rock and enormous flocks, a cave carved deep into a hillside, and something living within it that will offer no gentleness at all, no fruit, no welcome, no invitation to forget, only hunger and a single terrible eye opening slowly in the dark, patient as the sea itself, waiting for ships foolish enough to make landfall on its shore. The ships came upon the island in the grey hour before true morning, when the sea still held the colour of iron and the coastline ahead was only a suggestion of shadow against a slightly paler sky. It was not a place that announced itself with menace. There were no dark omens in the water, no strange birds wheeling overhead. There was only rock, pale and broken, rising into hills where goats moved in loose grey clusters. And beyond them, higher still, a cave mouth opening into the hillside, like a closed eye beginning, slowly, to consider waking. The men who rowed toward that shore did not know what waited within it. They knew only that days at sea had thinned their supplies, and that landfall, any landfall, offered the possibility of food, of fresh water, of solid ground, beneath feet grown unsteady with the endless motion of the swell. Odysseus, watching the hills grow larger, chose 12 men to go with him, a number the poem gives, with the same careful attention it gives to the shields and the ships, as though counting the dead before they have died, though none of them yet knew that this is what the counting meant. They found the cave large beyond ordinary reckoning, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor crowded with the accumulated wealth of a shepherd's solitary life, cheeses stacked in wicker racks, pails heavy with whey, lambs and kids penned in the rear recesses where the rock closed into darker dark. Odysseus's men, hungry and practical, urged him to take what they needed and returned swiftly to the ships, to vanish before whoever kept these flocks came home to find strangers among his stores. It is one of the poem's quiet ironies that this advice offered so plainly was the correct one, and that Odysseus, whose cunning would eventually save them, first overruled it. He wished to see the cave's owner. He wished, the poem suggests, without quite saying so, to test himself against whatever hospitality or violence a stranger might offer, still carrying the old expectation that the world honored guests, that even a solitary shepherd on a remote shore would recognize the sacred obligations owed to men arrived from the sea. The owner returned near dusk, and he was not a man in any way the sailors understood a man. He was vast, a shepherd, built to a scale that made the flocks around him look like toys arranged by a careless child, and he had, set in the center of his forehead, a single eye, wide and pale, and entirely without the softening company of a second gaze beside it. He rolled a stone across the cave mouth that a dozen ordinary men together could not have shifted, sealing the sailors inside with the same unthinking ease with which another man might close a garden gate. And when he saw the strangers gathered near his hearth, he did not offer welcome. He asked instead, in a voice the poem records as rough and echoing off the stone, who they were and where they had come from, and upon learning they were shipwrecked wanderers with no army at their backs, he answered their presence, not with hospitality, but with hunger, seizing two of the men and making of them without ceremony his evening meal. The scene that follows in the old telling is given without flinching, but also without indulgence, a horror recorded plainly the way one records weather or distance or the number of ships lost to a storm. The remaining men, penned through the night with the sound of the Cyclops' breathing filling the dark around them, understood that they had wandered into something the ordinary rules of the world did not govern. This was not a monster born of divine punishment aimed at them specifically, not a curse laid upon Odysseus alone. It was, the poem seems to suggest, simply what the edges of the world contained, creatures who lived by different laws in places where the old courtesies of host and guest had never taken root, because no one had ever needed them to. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the cave itself, to consider what such a creature might have meant to the people who first told this story, long before it found its way into Homer's ordered verses. The ancient Mediterranean, and Sicily in particular, the island most often proposed as the setting for this episode, was home to real pastoral peoples who lived exactly this way. Alone or in small isolated groups, tending flocks in high cave-dotted hills, distant from cities, distant from the courts and harbors where hospitality was law. Anthropologists who study the folk memory embedded in myth have long noted that isolated shepherd communities, especially those clinging to remote or volcanic terrain, tend to accumulate around them exactly this kind of story, tales of enormous half-human figures dwelling apart from ordinary society. Dangerous not from malice exactly, but from simply never having been taught or never having needed the rules that bind other men. The Cyclops, in this reading, is not wholly invention. He is a distillation, a single vast figure, standing in for every hermit shepherd whose isolation had, over generations of storytelling, curdled into something monstrous in the retelling, the stranger at the edge of the known world, magnified by distance and fear, into a giant with an appetite for those who wandered too far from home. And there is another thread, quieter still, that scholars have followed toward the origin of this particular monster's most famous feature, that single staring eye set high in a face too large for any living man. Sicily and the wider Mediterranean basin are rich in the fossilized remains of dwarf elephants, a species that once roamed these islands before dying into extinction and leaving behind skulls of considerable strangeness. Such a skull, weathered by centuries and stripped of its lower jaw, presents an odd and striking feature to eyes that do not know what they are looking at. A single large cavity in the center of the forehead, where in life the trunk's nasal passage had run, giving the whole skull the unmistakable appearance to someone unfamiliar with elephant anatomy of a single, vast eye socket in the middle of a giant's face. Ancient peoples digging into hillsides or discovering such skulls exposed by erosion or landslide would have had no framework for understanding elephants, animals long vanished from those particular shores. What they found instead looked very much like the bones of a race of one-eyed giants, and it is not difficult to imagine how such a discovery, passed hand to hand and told fireside to fireside, might have hardened over generations into exactly the creature the poem describes, a being whose bones still lay scattered in the hills of Sicily, waiting to be misread by anyone who did not yet understand what an elephant was. Within the story itself, escape came not through force, which the men lacked entirely against a creature of such size, but through patience and cunning. And it is here that Odysseus's particular genius, the quality the poem prizes above courage or strength, is given its clearest expression. He offered the Cyclops wine, strong and unwatered, a gift the giant had no experience refusing, and as the creature grew heavy and slow with drink, Odysseus told him a name, not his own, but a false one, calling himself Nobody, a small joke folded into the story that would soon prove essential to their survival. When the wine had done its work and the giant slept, Odysseus and his remaining men drove a heated stake into the single eye, blinding him in his sleep. And when the Cyclops' neighbors came running at his roars of pain, asking who had hurt him, he could only answer that nobody had done this to him. And hearing this, his neighbors, assuming he suffered from some private affliction or divine madness, went back to their own caves and left him to his blindness alone. The escape that followed, the men lashed beneath the bellies of the giant's own sheep, passing unseen beneath his groping, sightless hands as he searched the cave mouth for intruders, is told with the same patient, unhurried attention given to every other detail of this episode. A slow unspooling of cleverness rather than a sudden dramatic rescue. And it might have ended there, with the men safely returned to their ships, the danger left behind on the shore, along with the blinded giant's rage. But Odysseus, once safely aboard and pulling away from land, could not resist calling back across the water his true name, boasting of his victory, unable to let the giant believe he had been bested by nobody at all, needing instead the fullest satisfaction of being known. It was this, not the blinding, not the theft of food, not the trespass into the cave itself, that the poem marks as the true cost of the episode. For the Cyclops, hearing that name, called out to his father, the god of the sea itself, cursing Odysseus by name, and asking that his journey home be made, long and bitter and full of loss. It is a strange and quiet moment of reckoning. Hubris here is not punished by thunderbolt or sudden catastrophe, but simply by the ordinary mechanism of a father hearing his son's suffering and answering it with the tools available to him. The sea god's curse would follow the ships for years afterward, shaping every disaster still to come, not because Odysseus was wicked, but because he could not resist being known, could not let a victory pass without his name attached to it, a very old and very human failing that the poem records. Only the patient understanding that some cost is always paid for wanting, above safety itself, to be remembered. The ships that carried this new weight of divine displeasure sailed on as ships must, because the alternative was to remain still upon a sea that offered no shelter for stillness. And it was in this uncertain passage with Poseidon's anger now a permanent companion beneath the hull, that the fleet came upon an island unlike any they had seen before. A floating island, the poem says, ringed by a wall of bronze, so smooth and unbroken. Here lived Aeolus, keeper of the winds, a figure who ruled not a kingdom of soil and stone, but a kingdom of air and pressure, of gusts and calms, of the invisible currents that decided whether a ship might sail home in 10 days or founder in 10 years. To ancient sailors who had no instruments beyond a wetted finger and long memory, who could not chart isobars or predict a front rolling in from the west, the behavior of wind must have seemed nothing short of divine temperament, arbitrary, moody, capable of sudden violence and equally sudden mercy. It made a certain sense, then, that somewhere at the edge of the known sea there should live a being who held all these winds as a shepherd holds his flock, releasing one and restraining the others, deciding by whim or by favor which vessel would find fair passage and which would be driven back upon itself. Aeolus received Odysseus with a hospitality that the poem lingers on with unusual warmth, feasting him for a month, asking after the fall of Troy, listening to the tale with the patience of a man who has all the time in the world because he governs the very forces that measure it. And when at last Odysseus asked to leave, Aeolus gave him a gift suited exactly to his power. A great leather bag, tied shut with a silver cord, containing every contrary wind that might have blown the ships astray. Only the gentle west wind was left free to carry them steadily home. It is worth pausing on how carefully practical this gift is, how little it resembles the flashier miracles of other episodes. There is no monster here, no spell, only the plain image of a sailor being handed exactly what he needs. Favorable conditions, contained danger, a straightforward path home, and being trusted to carry it wisely. For 9 days, the poem tells us, this trust held. Odysseus himself stood at the helm the entire time, unwilling to delegate the one task that mattered most, and Ithaca came into view, close enough that men could see fires burning on its hills. And then, in the sight of home, sleep took him, a very human failure, the same fatigue that undoes armies and sailors and travelers of every era, and his own men, believing the bag held treasure withheld from them, loosened the silver cord. The winds broke free all at once, a chaos of conflicting pressures, and drove the ships back across the entire distance they had just crossed, back to Aeolus's island, where the keeper of winds now refused them a second gift, declaring that a man so clearly cursed by the gods. It is a small, quiet tragedy, embedded in a larger one, the closeness of homecoming, the ordinary human weakness that undid it, and the ancient sense that fortune once spent does not return twice from the same source. From there, the fleet drifted into darker waters and encountered the Laestrygonians, giants who hurled boulders and speared men like fish, destroying all the ships save one, a detail the poem delivers without lingering horror, simply as a fact of the voyage's accumulating losses. Each subtraction of ships and men narrowing the story toward its single surviving vessel, and it was this last ship, carrying what remained of the fleet, that came at last to the island of Aeaea, where Circe lived. Circe's island announces itself first through scent and smoke rising from a stone house set deep in oak forest, and then through the strange sight of wolves and lions moving among the trees, creatures who did not attack the approaching sailors, but instead nuzzled against them like household dogs greeting a familiar step. This detail, more than any other, signals to the listener that something is deeply wrong here, some inversion of the natural order beneath the beauty of the place. Circe herself is described weaving at a loom, singing in a voice so lovely that men found themselves walking toward her house before deciding to do so, drawn the way sailors are drawn toward any voice heard clearly across still water. She welcomed Odysseus's men with wine, cheese, barley and honey, the hospitality of a proper hostess, but mixed into the wine a drug that stripped away their memory of home and touched each man with her wand to complete the transformation into swine. Though the poem notes with quiet precision that their minds remained human even as their bodies became animal, so that they retained full awareness of what they had lost, a detail more unsettling than any straightforward monstrousness could achieve. Only one man escaped to warn Odysseus, and it was on the path toward confronting Circe that Odysseus met Hermes, who gave him an herb called moly, black-rooted, white-flowered, difficult for mortals to dig from the earth, the poem says, though easy for the gods. This plant, along with the simple advice not to eat or drink what Circe offered without protection, was what allowed Odysseus to resist her drug when she gave it to him in turn, and to draw his sword when she raised her wand, forcing her to relent and restore his men. Here it is, worth pausing to consider what this episode may have preserved of much older and more ordinary fears. The ancient Mediterranean world, like every culture built along trade routes and unfamiliar coastlines, held a persistent unease about the foreign healer, the woman who lived alone with knowledge of plants that could cure or kill depending on dose and intention. Circe is called a sorceress, but she is also, in the plainest sense, someone extraordinarily skilled in what we might now call pharmacology, the properties of local flora, the difference between a plant that nourishes and one that poisons, the exact quantity that separates medicine from murder. Sailors returning from distant shores would have brought home stories of foreign women who tended gardens no one else understood, who could heal wounds with poultices unfamiliar to Greek medicine, or who might just as easily, through malice or misunderstanding, offer a guest something that stole his senses or his life. The figure of the enchantress who transforms men into beasts may be, at its root, a poetic exaggeration of something far more mundane and far more common in the ancient world: the genuine danger of accepting food and drink from strangers whose knowledge of the land exceeded your own, whose intentions could not be verified, and whose hospitality, however genuine it appeared, existed within a framework of unequal power that always favored the host. Circe's island, in this light, becomes less a fantastical horror and more a heightened memory of every strange harbor where sailors ate what they were given and hoped for the best, sometimes waking transformed by illness, confusion, or drugged wine into something less than themselves, unable to articulate clearly what had happened until the effects wore off, if they wore off at all. Once Circe relented, she became, in another turn, the poem treats, without excessive comment, a genuinely helpful host, restoring the men, feasting the crew for a year, and finally advising Odysseus that before he could complete his voyage home, he must undertake a journey no living man had attempted, a descent into the land of the dead. To consult the blind prophet Tiresias, the only shade in the underworld, permitted by Persephone to retain full knowledge and reason even after death. This journey to the underworld is described not through the sea route that carried them there, the north wind driving the ship across the river ocean to the very edge of the world, but through the ritual required once they arrived. A pit dug into the earth, libations of milk, honey, wine, and water poured into it. Black ram and ewe sacrificed so their blood might draw the shades of the dead close enough to speak. Odysseus met his own mother among the crowding spirits, unaware, until that moment, that she had died of grief during his long absence. And he met old comrades from Troy, their voices thin and strange, hungry for the taste of blood before they could speak clearly. And at last, Tiresias came and delivered the prophecy that would shape the rest of the voyage, warning of the cattle of the sun god still to come, and speaking more distantly of a quiet death that would eventually find Odysseus far from the sea, though the details of this ending remain deliberately vague, a mercy the poem offers its hero. It is worth reflecting, in this quieter passage of the story, on how naturally this vision of the underworld's entrance may have grown from real geography. The ancient Mediterranean world was scattered with caves, sulphurous springs, volcanic fissures from which strange vapors rose, places where the earth itself seemed to breathe something unnatural, where birds reportedly would not fly overhead, where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beneath it felt uncomfortably thin. Sites across the Greek world were named as entrances to the underworld for exactly this reason. Genuine geological features, genuinely strange in their smoke, their heat, their silence, interpreted by a culture that had no framework for volcanic gas or sulfur springs beyond the language of myth. Odysseus's descent, then, should not be read only as fantasy, but as a poetic memory of real places sailors feared and avoided, real caves where something in the air itself seemed to press close to death, and where the boundary between the world of ships and the world beneath it felt, for a moment, entirely too thin to trust. The ship sailed on, as ships in old stories always must, carrying its crew away from the thin place between worlds and back into the ordinary business of wind and oar and salt. But Circe, before they left her island, had given Odysseus a warning that no captain could hear without a tightening in the chest. That ahead lay a stretch of sea where voices would call to him from the water, voices so beautiful that men had died simply from turning their ships toward the sound. She told him of the sirens, not as a passing hazard, but as an inevitability, a place the ship could not avoid, only endure. And so as the vessel approached that stretch of coast, the air itself seemed to change, the wind dropping, the sea flattening into a stillness that felt less like calm than like held breath. Odysseus did what the goddess had instructed. He took soft wax, warmed it in his hands until it grew pliable, and pressed it into the ears of every rower on the ship, sealing them one by one against whatever was coming. Then he had his men bind him to the mast, not loosely, not as a gesture, but with real rope, wound tightly enough to hold a man who might, in the grip of that song, tear himself apart trying to reach it. He wanted to hear. That was the strange human detail the poem insists upon. Not that he feared the sirens, but that he could not resist wanting to know what they sounded like, even knowing the cost. He asked to be tied precisely because he trusted himself so little. The ship glided into the waters where the sirens waited, and the song began. The poem describes it only in fragments. Praise for Odysseus's fame, promises of knowledge no mortal had ever possessed. An invitation phrased so gently, it felt less like temptation than like homecoming. It did not sound like danger. That, perhaps, is the detail worth sitting with longest. The sirens did not shriek or threaten. They offered comfort, understanding the illusion that whatever lay beyond that voice was safety rather than wreckage. Odysseus strained against his ropes, gesturing wildly for his men to release him. His sealed-eared crew rowing on exactly as instructed, unable to hear either the song or his pleading, following only the plan made before the danger arrived. The ship passed through. The voices faded behind them into the ordinary hiss of water against the hull, and the world slowly became ordinary again. It is easy, hearing this episode read aloud, to picture something wholly supernatural, women with the bodies of birds perched on rocks, luring sailors purely through magic. But sailors of the ancient Mediterranean and the poets who shaped their fears into verse rarely invented danger from nothing. The coastlines of Greece and Italy are littered with places where the sea behaves strangely, where currents run contrary to what the eye expects, where rocks lie just beneath a deceptively smooth surface, where the appearance of calm water conceals turbulence capable of splitting a hull without warning. Sailors navigating by sight and memory, without instruments beyond the stars and the shape of the coast, learned early that the sea's most dangerous moments often looked like its safest ones. A stretch of glassy water near a rocky headland might be the surface expression of an undertow strong enough to drag a boat sideways into stone. A gentle sound carried on wind across open water might be nothing more than the particular acoustic trick of certain coastal cliffs, amplifying and distorting distant noise into something that seemed, if a sailor was tired enough, almost like singing. The sirens, then, may be best understood not as literal creatures, but as the accumulated caution of generations of sailors compressed into story, a way of teaching new crews that the sea's beauty was not to be trusted. That longing to draw closer to what looked peaceful could be the very thing that killed you. The wax in the ears becomes, in this light, a poetic instruction. Do not listen to the sea's invitations. The ropes around the mast become a reminder that even the most experienced captain needed restraint built into the voyage itself. Some mechanism beyond willpower to keep the ship on course. It is a story about discipline disguised as a story about monsters, and the poem is careful to make Odysseus not immune to temptation but bound against it, which is a more honest picture of how sailors actually survived such waters than any claim of pure heroism would have been. From the Sirens' waters, the ship moved onward into a passage that ancient listeners would have recognized as the most feared stretch of sea in the entire epic, a narrow strait bordered on either side by monstrous danger, where choosing one path meant losing something. On one side waited Scylla, a creature with 6 heads and a voice like the yelping of dogs, positioned in a cave, high on a cliff face, able to snatch sailors directly from the deck of a passing ship. On the other side waited Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed the sea itself 3 times a day, drawing entire ships down into her throat and spitting the water back out in a violence that could destroy a vessel outright. Circe had warned Odysseus plainly, there was no way through without loss. He could sail close to Scylla and lose 6 men, snatched instantly from the ship, or he could try to avoid her and risk Charybdis pulling the entire vessel down, killing everyone aboard. There was no third option. The poem does not offer one. It is one of the rare moments in the Odyssey where the hero is given no clever trick, no disguise, no riddle to solve, only the grim mathematics of necessary loss. He chose Scylla, as instructed, keeping the ship as far from the whirlpool as the strait allowed, watching in helpless silence as 6 of his men were lifted screaming from the deck, their voices calling his name as the creature carried them into her cave. He describes it in Homer's telling as the most pitiful sight of the entire journey, worse, in his memory, than nearly everything else that had come before it, because it happened in full view, close enough to see their faces, too far to do anything at all. Scholars examining this passage over centuries have often turned their attention to the Strait of Mycenae, the narrow channel separating the Italian mainland from Sicily, as a plausible real-world counterpart to this mythic strait. The identification is not certain. The ancient Mediterranean held many narrow, dangerous passages, and the poem's geography resists precise mapping, but the Strait of Mycenae fits the description with an eerie closeness that has kept the association alive since antiquity. The strait is famously narrow, barely 2 miles across at its tightest point, and the waters within it are shaped by a genuine and well-documented phenomenon, the meeting of 2 different bodies of water, the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Ionian, whose differing temperatures, salinities, and tidal rhythms create currents of remarkable strength and unpredictability. Sailors moving through the strait, even in more recent centuries, described sudden violent eddies capable of spinning a ship off course, strong tidal bores that reverse direction with startling speed, and patches of turbulence that seem to appear without warning in otherwise calm water. But a real whirlpool does exist within the strait, smaller and less catastrophic than Charybdis's mythic version, but genuinely capable in certain conditions of disorienting or even damaging small vessels caught unprepared. The cliffs along the Italian side of the strait, meanwhile, rise steeply from the water in a way that would have made the idea of a creature lurking in a high cave entirely plausible to ancient sailors passing close beneath them, straining to keep clear of the whirlpool on the opposite shore. It is not difficult to imagine crews, generation after generation, recounting near disasters in that narrow water, ships nearly capsized by sudden currents, sailors lost overboard in turbulence that seemed to come from nowhere, vessels forced dangerously close to rock faces by forces no oar could resist. Giving those forces names, faces, hungers, Charybdis becomes the whirlpool sailors had genuinely feared. Scylla becomes the cliffs that had genuinely claimed lives. The two together become a story that could be told to new sailors before they entered that stretch of water, a warning wrapped in monstrous imagery, precisely because monstrous imagery is what survives in memory when practical warnings fade. This is perhaps the quiet truth beneath so much of the Odyssey's supernatural terrain, that ancient peoples, standing before natural forces vast beyond their understanding or control, reached instinctively for story as a way of making those forces comprehensible, even survivable. A whirlpool without a name is simply chaos, a physical process indifferent to the sailors caught within it. A whirlpool named Charybdis, given hunger and rhythm and a reason for its violence, becomes something a sailor can respect, avoid, and prepare for, even if the preparation amounts only to staying close to the opposite shore and hoping the toll asked of 6 lives is smaller than the toll asked of all. The line between geological hazard and monster, in this way, was never truly a line at all. Only the distance between a fear observed and a fear given voice passed from one generation of sailors to the next, until the story became itself a kind of navigational chart, marking not coordinates, but caution. Not distances, but the shape of dread that every ship approaching that narrow water was expected quietly to carry with it. The ship that survived Scylla carried its exhaustion into calmer water, and it was there in the hush that follows terror that the crew first saw the island of Thrinacia rising low and gold against the horizon, and Odysseus, who had heard a prophecy concerning this place from the blind seer Tiresias in the underworld, felt something in him tighten with a dread that had nothing to do with monsters. He knew or believed he knew what grazed there. He had been warned. And the warning was simple, almost plain in its wording, the kind of instruction that seems easy to obey until hunger makes it otherwise. The cattle of Helios, the sun god, grazed upon that island, immortal and gleaming, untouched by time or slaughter, and no sailor was to lift a hand against them, not for hunger, not for desperation, not for any reason the sea could offer as justification. To touch them was to invite a ruin beyond even what the sea itself could provide. Odysseus tried to sail past. This detail matters in the slow retelling, because it separates him from the version of the story where the disaster is his own recklessness. He begged his men to keep rowing, to let the island pass unclaimed, to trust that safety lay in distance rather than rest. But the men were tired in a way that made caution feel like cruelty. They had been at sea long enough that solid ground, any ground, had become a kind of fever dream. And when Eurylochus, the same officer who had once urged restraint at Circe's threshold, now urged the opposite, rest, only a night's mooring before the winds turned favorable again, Odysseus relented, extracting only a promise, fragile as sea foam, that no one would touch the cattle grazing in the green fields beyond the shore. For a time, the promise held. The ship rested in a sheltered cove. The men ate what stores remained, thin and joyless, and the days passed in the particular misery of hunger without solution. Supplies dwindling, wind refusing to rise. It is worth pausing on this hunger, not as a dramatic device, but as a plain historical fact of ancient seafaring. Ships of this era carried grain, wine, dried meat, oil, in quantities that could be exhausted within weeks, and a becalmed vessel waiting on wind that refused to come was a vessel slowly starving in full view of abundance. It had been forbidden to touch. The cattle grazed calmly in their fields, fat and unbothered day after day, while the crew grew gaunt and quiet, and began to look at one another with the specific silence of men calculating how much longer principle can survive against need. It happened, as these things tend to happen, while Odysseus slept. Whether this detail is myth's convenient excuse or a literal truth passed down through generations of tellers, the story insists that the fatal choice was made in his absence, that Eurylochus gathered the starving men and argued what starving men always argue, that a good death by the sword, quick and dignified, was preferable to the slow humiliation of wasting away on a becalmed ship for the sake of cattle that belonged to a god who might never notice their absence from so vast and gleaming a herd. They sacrificed what they took, offering what rites they could improvise, with leaves in place of barley and water in place of wine, trying in their hunger to make theft resemble reverence. They ate. For 6 days they ate, roasting the meat, and telling themselves, perhaps, that a god so distant might overlook so small a theft, that the sea had asked so much of them already, that this single trespass could be forgiven. The god noticed. This is the plain, unadorned turn the story takes, and it is worth narrating without embellishment, because the myth itself offers little. Helios, seeing his cattle slaughtered, went to Zeus and demanded restitution, threatening, in his fury, to take his light down into the underworld and shine there instead, leaving the world in darkness until his cattle were avenged. Zeus, whatever cosmic accounting governs such matters, agreed. And when at last the winds rose and the ship pushed back into open water, the calm broke into something else entirely, a storm arriving without the courtesy of warning. Black clouds gathering with a suddenness that felt, to those aboard, less like weather and more like judgment. Lightning struck the mast. The ship split under the force of it, timbers scattering into water, gone the color of iron, and the crew, every one of them, all the men who had survived Circe and the Cyclops and the long grinding losses before, went down into the sea and did not come up again. Odysseus alone survived, clinging to the broken keel and the fallen mast, lashed together with whatever cord the wreck had left him, drifting for 9 days upon a sea indifferent to his singular grief, carried finally back past Charybdis, which he escaped once more by clutching a fig tree growing from a cliff face until the whirlpool released what it had swallowed, spitting the wreckage back into open water where he could reclaim it and drift onward, alone now in every sense the word permits, without ship, without crew. It is here, in this solitary drifting, that the poem slows into something closer to stillness, and it is fitting, perhaps, that this stillness delivered him to an island that was itself a kind of suspended time. Ogygia, the story calls it the home of Calypso, a nymph of extraordinary and lonely beauty, who found the exhausted, shipwrecked man upon her shore and took him in, and who kept him for 7 years in a captivity so strange it resists easy naming. It was not imprisonment in the manner of chains or walls. Calypso offered comfort, offered her own devotion, offered, the poem tells us, immortality itself, a life beside her that would never end if only Odysseus would set aside the memory of Ithaca and the wife waiting there and choose to stay. And for 7 years he did not choose to leave, though the poem insists this was not truly a choice at all, but a slow erosion of will against an isolation so complete that resistance itself became difficult to sustain. Historians and scholars reading this section across centuries have often paused longer here than anywhere else in the journey, because the 7 years of Ogygia say less about monsters and more about the particular psychology of long absence, the way isolation reshapes longing, the way comfort offered without escape becomes its own quiet erosion. Ancient sailors, real ones, did vanish for years at a time, driven by storm or trade winds far from charted routes, sometimes making landfall on islands so remote that months or years passed before another ship's sail appeared on the horizon to carry word home. Some, we can only assume, remained on those islands the rest of their lives, absorbed into unfamiliar shores, their names lost to the families who waited and eventually stopped waiting. Calypso's island in this light becomes less a fantastical invention and more a distillation of a very real and very ancient fear. The sailor who does not drown, does not die, but simply disappears into distance, swallowed not by the sea's violence, but by its size. Scholars proposing real geography for Ogygia have pointed toward various small islands scattered across the central Mediterranean. Malta's satellite island of Gozo has been named more than once, its caves and coastal solitude offered as a plausible seed for the myth. Toward the Strait of Gibraltar and islands lying just beyond the known edge of the ancient Greek world, where Ogygia's placement at the very margins of geography would align with its symbolic role as a place outside of time, a threshold beyond which no ordinary map extended. Whether or not a single island deserves the name, the pattern holds true across the ancient Mediterranean: small, isolated landmasses, difficult to reach and easy to lose, scattered along trade routes where storms could carry a ship far past its intended course, offering both danger and, paradoxically, a strange kind of shelter to those who found them. What lingers longest in this portion of the story, though, is not the geography, but the peculiar elasticity of time it describes. The sense so faithfully rendered by the poem that 7 years spent in isolation can feel both endless and strangely brief. That captivity without visible chains can stretch a person's sense of duration into something unrecognizable. Sailors of the ancient world, cut off from any means of marking days beyond the sun's slow arc and the moon's patient cycling, often lost precise account of how much time had actually passed, and myths across many cultures echo this same disorientation, only to find that decades have slipped by unnoticed, the world reshaped in their absence. Odysseus, weeping each day on Calypso's shore, staring out toward a sea that offered him no ship and no path home, embodies this disorientation as much as any figure in ancient story, a man for whom time had become something the sea decided, rather than something he could measure or govern for himself. His only calendar, the horizon. Empty morning after morning, promising nothing, remembering nothing, keeping its silence exactly as it always had. Calypso released him at last, not from mercy, but from command, the gods above intervening where sentiment alone had failed, Hermes descending with instructions that even a goddess could not refuse. And so Odysseus built his raft with his own hands, felling trees on the island's edge, binding the timbers with rope and pitch, working alone for 4 slow days, while the goddess who had loved him watched from a distance, offering tools and cloth and provisions, her grief folded quietly beneath the practical business of departure. There is something worth pausing on in this image, a man constructing his own escape from paradise, plank by plank, with the patient labor of someone who has learned that the sea does not care for haste, that only careful work will carry a body across such distance. He was no longer young. 20 years had passed since he'd left Ithaca, a husband and a father, and the raft he built was not the ship of a king, but the vessel of a survivor. Small and low against the water, meant only to carry one man toward a hope he had almost stopped allowing himself to feel. The sea, however, was not finished with him. Poseidon, spotting the raft from his own distant travels, raised one final storm. Not out of any new offense, but out of old anger, unresolved since the blinding of Polyphemus, anger that the years had not softened. The waves that struck Odysseus were described by the poem with a violence matched to their finality. The last true test the sea would demand of him, masts splitting, raft breaking apart beneath him, the man himself flung into water that seemed determined, even now, even after everything, to keep him from ever again standing on solid ground. He swam for 2 days and nights without rest, guided at last by a sea goddess's veil that kept him afloat, until he washed ashore on the coast of Phaeacia, naked, exhausted, covering himself with branches, sleeping beneath olive trees, until a young princess and her attendants playing ball near the shore. The Phaeacians received him with the hospitality the ancient world prized above nearly every other virtue, feeding him, clothing him, asking his story only after he had eaten, listening to the long account of his wanderings with the rapt attention of people who understood that a guest's tale was itself a form of payment for shelter given. It was here, in their halls, that Odysseus narrated much of what modern audiences now know as his journey. The Cyclops, the winds, the sirens, the cattle of the sun, the underworld's grey company of the dead. And when his story ended, the Phaeacians did what their culture required of them. They gave him a ship, crewed it with their own sailors, and sent him home at last, asking nothing in return but the honor of having helped a wandering stranger find his way. He arrived at Ithaca, sleeping, carried ashore by sailors who did not wake him, laid gently on the sand of his own island while he dreamed on, unaware for the first waking moments that the soil beneath him was the very soil he had left 20 years before. When he woke, he did not recognize it. A deliberate touch in the poem, a final disorientation before the homecoming could properly begin. The goddess Athena having shrouded the landscape in mist so that Odysseus might first move through his own kingdom as a stranger, testing the ground carefully. And tested he did, for Ithaca was not the home he had left. His palace had filled in his long absence with suitors, over 100 men from the surrounding islands, each pressing his own claim on Penelope's hand, each treating Odysseus's house as a kind of open larder, feasting on his stores, courting his wife, disrespecting his son. Certain that the king was dead and that his kingdom now belonged to whichever suitor Penelope finally chose. 20 years is a long time for hope to survive, and the suitor's confidence was not unreasonable. No news of Odysseus had come in a decade, and even those loyal to him had begun to accept, quietly, painfully, that he was likely gone for good. Athena disguised Odysseus as an old beggar before he entered his own halls, bent, ragged, unremarkable, the very image of a man the suitors would dismiss without a second look. This disguise allowed him to move through his own home unseen for his true self, gathering information, testing loyalties, watching the disorder that had taken root in his absence. It is here that the poem offers one of its quietest, most devastating moments. The recognition of Argos, his old hunting dog, now aged and neglected, lying in a heap of refuse outside the gate, forgotten by nearly everyone but still somehow retaining in whatever capacity a dog's memory allows. The shape of his master's voice and step. Just lifted his head as Odysseus passed, ears rising, tail attempting one final motion of greeting, and then, task complete, recognition achieved after 20 years of waiting, the old dog died. Odysseus in disguise could not risk revealing his grief, and so he wiped away a single tear in secret and walked on, the scene passing without spectacle, without music swelling, just a small quiet death, marking the passage of decades in a single gesture of loyalty outlasting absence. Historians and readers alike have long paused over the plausibility of what follows. A king, gone 20 years, presumed dead by nearly everyone, somehow reclaiming his household, his wife, and his throne, through patience and careful revelation. It is worth considering how such a return might have actually unfolded in the world that produced this story. A world where kingship was as much about recognition and loyalty as about bloodline, where a returning ruler needed allies within his own walls before he could hope to reclaim what time and rumor had allowed others to claim in his stead. The poem's slow unspooling of Odysseus's identity, servant by servant, test by test, reflects perhaps a genuine understanding of how such a return needed to happen, not with triumphant announcement, but through careful accumulation of trust, verification and support. Each ally won before the final confrontation could be risked. The recognition scenes themselves unfold with a patience that mirrors this logic exactly. His old nurse, washing the beggar's feet as custom required, discovers a scar on his thigh, a wound from a boar hunt in his youth, and recognizes him instantly, nearly crying out before Odysseus silences her, swearing her to secrecy until the right moment arrives. It is a small mark, a childhood injury, and yet it becomes the thread by which 20 years are stitched back together, the body itself carrying proof that words alone could never quite provide. Penelope, for her part, has spent these same 20 years in a different kind of siege, holding off suitors through delay and cleverness, most famously by promising to choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father, only to unpick her work each night in secret, buying herself and her absent husband more time. When Odysseus at last reveals himself to her after the suitors have been dealt with, after the beggar's disguise has served its purpose, she does not simply accept his word. She tests him, quietly, without cruelty, asking a servant to move the marriage bed from its chamber, knowing that Odysseus himself had built that bed around a living olive tree, rooted permanently into the floor, immovable by design. When Odysseus reacts with alarm at the suggestion the bed could be moved, knowing as only the man who built it could know that such a thing was impossible, Penelope finally allows herself to believe. The recognition is not a declaration of feeling, but a shared fact, a private detail known only to two people, surviving 20 years of separation intact, unspoken by anyone else because no one else could have spoken it. It is a quiet, exact scene, treated by the poem not with dramatic flourish, but with the reverence of long-delayed certainty. Finally, gently confirmed. The bow, too, plays its part in this slow unveiling, Penelope announcing a contest for her hand, that whoever can string Odysseus's old hunting bow and shoot an arrow through a row of axe heads will win her as wife. The suitors try and fail, one after another, their strength insufficient against a weapon that has waited 20 years for its owner's return. Odysseus, still disguised, asks to try, is mocked, is allowed only as an old man's curiosity, and strings the bow with the same ease he always had, the wood remembering his grip, as surely as Argos had remembered his step, as surely as the bed had remembered its builder's design. What follows? The slaughter of the suitors, the restoration of order, occupies its own dramatic space in the poem, yet it is worth noting that even here, the true climax the epic has been building toward is not violence but recognition, not conquest but return. The suitors' deaths resolve a political problem. The recognition scenes resolve the deeper one, the question the entire poem has quietly circled from its opening lines. Can a man, gone so long that his own dog barely survives to see him, his wife nearly remarried, his son grown into adulthood without him, still find his way back, not just to a place, but to the people who once knew him and be known again? This, more than any monster faced or storm survived, may be the epic's true center. The Cyclops and the Sirens, the cattle of the sun, and the depths of the underworld are trials of survival, tests of cunning and endurance against forces indifferent to any single human life. But homecoming is a different kind of trial altogether, one that cannot be won through cleverness alone, that requires instead the slow rebuilding of trust, the patient reassembly of a life left in fragments, the quiet hope that 20 years of absence has not erased every trace of who a person once was. The sea, in the end, was only ever the obstacle. The true journey was always toward this, a scar recognized, a tree still rooted in its floor, a bow remembering its owner's hand, an old dog's tail lifting once more before it finally peacefully was allowed to rest. In the centuries that followed, the poem's first fixed telling, long after it had passed from the mouths of wandering singers into the careful hands of scribes, people continued to ask the question that perhaps can never be fully answered. Did any of this happen? Not whether a man returned home after long absence, for that has happened countless times, in countless small ways, since humans first learned to leave and to miss. But whether there was a war at Troy at all resembling the one remembered, whether a king named Odysseus ever stood on a beach and looked toward a home he had not seen in 20 years, whether the sea he crossed was the same sea that still moves today beneath the same slow moon. It was a German businessman, self-taught and driven by a boy's stubborn faith in old stories, who first turned that question into a shovel. Heinrich Schliemann came to the mound at Hissarlik in the latter half of the 19th century, believing with a conviction that scholars of his time found almost embarrassing, that Homer's Troy was not myth but memory buried under layers of earth. He dug, impatiently, sometimes carelessly, cutting through strata that more careful hands would later wish he had left undisturbed. And yet beneath his impatient trenches he found something that could not be entirely dismissed. A city, several cities in truth, stacked one atop another like pages in a book no one had thought to keep in order, each layer a different age, a different fire, a different fall. Somewhere among those layers, archaeologists still argue over which one might correspond to the war the poem remembers, if any does at all. The gold he found and smuggled out under his wife's name, calling it the treasure of Priam, almost certainly belonged to a period 1,000 years before any war that might have inspired Homer's story. It did not matter. The mound was real. The city, in some form, across many centuries, had truly stood there, overlooking the strait, exactly where the poem said a great city should be. After Schliemann came others, more careful, more patient, correcting his errors and refining the picture layer by layer. Wilhelm Dörtfeld, and later Karl Bliegen, and in more recent decades, teams from Germany and the United States working together with a patience that Schliemann himself never possessed, mapping the mound with instruments that could see what the eye alone could not, tracing walls and gates and the burned layer that might, just might, correspond to the fall the poem describes. They found evidence of destruction by fire in a level archaeologists call Troy Vidden, dated to a time not far from when a Bronze Age war of the kind the poem imagines could plausibly have occurred. They found arrowheads. They found signs of a hurried, crowded habitation, as if the city had swollen with refugees before its end, and then had ended violently. Whether this was Homer's war, whether this was Priam's city, whether any single conflict lies behind 10 years of a poem's imagining, remains a question no shovel has fully answered and likely never will. Beyond the mound at Hissarlik, other scholars turned their eyes to the sea itself. And here, the search became even more uncertain, even more haunted by the poem's deliberate refusal to be pinned to any single map. If Troy could at least be located, argued over, excavated, the wanderings of the return proved far more elusive. Where were the lotus eaters? Where was the cave of the one-eyed shepherd? Where did the winds of Aeolus blow from, and toward what unnamed island did Circe's smoke rise? Scholars and sailors alike have spent lifetimes tracing possible routes across the Mediterranean, matching currents and winds and the shapes of coastlines to the poem's descriptions, proposing Sicily for the Cyclops, the Lipari Islands for Aeolus, the strait between Italy and Sicily for Scylla and Charybdis, the western coast of Greece for Circe's misty island. Each proposal has its evidence, its defenders, its skeptics. None has ever been proven beyond every reasonable doubt. The truth, most likely, is that the poem was never meant to be a map at all, but something closer to a dream, stitched from 100 sailors' half-remembered voyages, each contributing a headland here, a current there, a monster born from a genuine navigational terror somewhere in the deep water between one shore and another. In more recent years, marine archaeologists have taken up tools that Schliemann could never have imagined. Sonar and remote submersibles, careful surveys of seabeds along ancient trade routes, searching not for Odysseus himself, for no one seriously expects to find a ship bearing his name, but for the broader world the poem emerged from. They have found Bronze Age wrecks off the Turkish coast, at Uluburun and elsewhere, laden with copper and tin and glass, cargo that speaks of a world exactly as interconnected, as far-traveling as the poem's own imagined Mediterranean. These wrecks cannot confirm a single word of Homer's story, but they confirm its world. They confirm that ships did cross these waters, that trade and war and disaster did entangle distant shores, that a sailor from a Greek island truly might have found himself, through storm or misfortune, washed up on some unfamiliar coast far from home, exactly as the poem imagines happening again and again to its wandering king. And so the honest summary, after a century and a half of digging and diving and careful argument, is this: much remains unproven and likely always will. There is no inscription anywhere that names Odysseus as a living man. There is no wreck that can be said with certainty to be his ship, no cave that can be proven to be the Cyclops's, no island that can be declared with confidence to be Circe's or Calypso's. What scholarship has given us instead is something quieter and in its way more valuable, a confirmation of the world's shape, the plausibility of the poem's geography, the historical reality of a war-torn city at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the genuine terrors and confusions that Bronze Age sailors faced on unfamiliar waters. The poem's specific hero may never be found, but the world he moves through, the fears he embodies, the coastlines he might have skirted, all of this rests on a foundation of real stone and real sediment and real human bone that continues even now to be uncovered a little more each year. What is perhaps more remarkable than any single archaeological find is the endurance of the story itself, the sheer improbability that words first shaped for memory and voice, composed in an age before writing was common among those who told such tales, should still be read and heard 3,000 years later. For centuries, the poem lived only in the mouths of singers, passed from teacher to student, each performance slightly different, shaped by the audience of that particular night, the mood of that particular hall. It was memory before it was text, sound before it was symbol. Only later, in the centuries after literacy spread more widely through the Greek world, was it fixed into the form we now call Homer, written onto scrolls, copied by careful hands in libraries at Alexandria and elsewhere, debated by scholars who argued even then about which lines were original and which had crept in through the long oral telling. From scroll it passed to parchment, from parchment eventually to the first printed pages, once movable type made such copying possible on a scale no scribe could match. From those early printed editions, it has continued outward into nearly every language spoken by those who care to translate it, each generation finding in it something slightly different to hold on to, an adventure story for some, a meditation on grief and homecoming for others, a window into an ancient world for the scholar, a comfort for anyone who has ever waited a long time for someone to come home. It is difficult to think of another piece of human storytelling that has traveled so far across time while remaining so recognizably itself. The same beats and dangers and longing present in a Bronze Age singer's performance and in a printed page read quietly tonight 3,000 years later by someone falling gently towards sleep. Picture, if it helps to picture anything at all, a stretch of water off one of the Greek islands tonight, moonlight settling in a long, pale line across its surface. The same kind of light that might have guided or confused sailors in ages before ships had any way to fix their position beyond the stars and their own memory of coastlines. The water folds quietly over stones near the shore, stones that may or may not have felt the drag of an ancient keel, that may or may not have witnessed some sailor's small triumph or private grief. The sea does not remember in any way that can be asked or answered. It simply continues, indifferent to whether a hero once crossed it or whether it was only ever imagined that he did. And perhaps that indifference is itself the poem's quietest truth. Humans have always longed for home, for recognition, for a hand that reaches out and knows us even after long absence, even after time has changed our shape and worn our voice. The sea does not share this longing. It simply moves. Tonight, as it moved 3,000 years ago, patient and vast and untroubled by the small, aching hopes carried across its surface by those who sail it. The poem endures because that longing endures, because every person who has ever waited for someone or been the one delayed in returning recognizes something of themselves in it. Parmik. Whether or not Odysseus ever truly lived, the ache to come home again, whole and known, is entirely permanently real. If this quiet wandering through old water and older stories has been good company for you tonight, you are welcome to return another evening, whenever you'd like, for more lost voyages waiting quietly in the dark for someone to listen.